My guest here today is Amit Chaudhuri, the author of 7 novels, the latest of which is Friend of My Youth. He is also an essayist, poet, musician, and composer. According to the historian Wendy Doniger, and we'll talk about this a little bit in the course of this interview, his novels are the most internal, psychological, delicately written, introspective of all contemporary Indian novelists. And having read Wendy Doniger on Amit Chaudhuri, I feel that I must register how much I concur with this, which is a great deal. Um, He's also a highly regarded singer in the Hindustani classical tradition. He is professor of contemporary literature at the University of East Anglia and was University College London's annual visiting fellow in 2018. That year, he was also an inaugural fellow at the Columbia Institute of Ideas and Imagination in Paris, and in 2019 became an honorary fellow at Balliol College, Oxford. You're in Calcutta right now, right? It's so tumultuous there right now, with the floods and with coronavirus, and how do you feel? What do you feel about the political situation right now?
Very depressing, extremely depressing. Um, I mean, activists are in jail. There's a senior poet and activist called Varavara Rao, who is old and has got COVID. Um, the justice system, you don't know what's happening to it. It was one thing that we, in spite of its many flaws and shortcomings, still depended on for all these decades.
I think one of the predominant senses that I developed through reading your work as a teenager and as an adult was how it seemed to shy away from the portentous chock full of very serious subjects that I had grown tired of reading about in South Asian fiction. Your work was perhaps less serious, but of course I know now that it was just as serious, if not more so. It was just less overt, more full of the texture of daily life that I recognized, more rooted in emotional affect than declarative. And I think this is why philosophers like Wendy Doniger, among others, have commented greatly on your work, because perhaps they, like me, craved writing about banality that could still be political. Do you see what I mean when I say that?
I mean, since you mentioned historians and philosophers, who to me seem two slightly different um, belong to slightly different species,
Yeah.
especially where South Asia is concerned. Um, I would say that I was pleasantly surprised to discover the, the genuine sort of um, feeling that 3 or 4 philosophers and historians had for my work, and they all uh, confessed this to me or revealed this to me at some point in my life when I first met them. Wendy Doniger, I came to know about because a woman, uh, an editor called Isabel Onions, who was at that time, I think, working for the Clay Sanskrit Library, suddenly called me and said, I'm in a pub with Wendy Doniger, and she loves your work and would like to speak to you. David Schulman I met in Berlin, and when I introduced myself, he was extremely kind about what my work meant to him. And in Berlin that year, Charles Taylor, the philosopher, when I first met him, said something overly generous. Um, and the other person, slightly unexpected for me, who said how much he liked my work is Ronajit Guho, the founder of Subaltern Studies. I mention these people for a few reasons. Firstly, um, it's 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 interesting to know that, you know, especially in a scenario where all the thinkers one is coming into touch with um, happen to be especially the closer you come to South Asia, happen to be social scientists or historians, and that there are very few literary critics among them. It's good to know that philosophers and historians continue to have a place for literature, because it's certainly not on the basis of my validation by the social sciences that I am of interest to them. I've had to fight for my path. I want to say this without sounding too melodramatic or self-aggrandizing. I hope it doesn't sound self-aggrandizing, because it has not been easy, and I think anybody will see that, to write and establish the kind of peculiar practice that I have been up to in a milieu in the milieu in which I've been writing. And so over there, the what I got back from these people was also of importance, because I was doubting my very existence uh, in, and I'm talking now about, say, the early part of this millennium, um, where, you know, things had metamorphosed completely with the market, and also the growing predominance of the social sciences in a way that I could not have expected, or would not have expected when I myself was a teenager, that the world that existed by then. So to get these kind of comments from these people was also surprising, and a kind of signal that there was something beyond what I took to be um, the hegemony of the social sciences which had come into existence then. And this takes me back to my earlier comment about historians and philosophers having become slightly different species, and especially in India. And by that I mean historians are very much embedded in India within a discourse to do with the social sciences, and in some way to do with the archive, the nation, and its past. Um, in fact, philosophers don't seem to exist in India at present. You don't find that many philosophers. And I'm sure they are there, but they are not in our consciousness. And I'm not only speaking about contemporaries, but philosophers over the last 70, 80 years. This absence of um, philosophers and philosophy, I think, has affected critical discourse, and therefore has also affected the way the work of someone such as myself is received in a kind of response, in a kind of milieu which is schooled by the social sciences.
I suppose I wonder two things about that which are related. The first is that are we talking about a situation of the creation of literature in the absence of the social sciences, or are we talking about the creation of literature that goes against the grain of social sciences? And is there a way in which your career has responded to both situations in some senses?
My trajectory has been one in which uh, the world I inhabited and which I wrote in was changing into a world in which the givens to do with literature became, um, you know, uh, dispensable and ceased to become valid. Um, the market changed things by the early 90s and permeated literary language
Yeah.
in such a way that um, we thought sort of quantifiable success to do with sales was actually a pertinent way of discussing literature. And as a result, um, words like masterpiece and classic became marketing terms.
Mm-hmm.
They were, as I've written before, they were disowned by the academy,
Yeah.
but they were picked up by the by literary publishers to market works, market new works as masterpieces, and this appropriation was neither noticed nor questioned by the academy. Um, so so you had that kind of change occurring in in the in the world in which I began to publish from 1991 onwards, which is around the time when the Berlin Wall comes down and the free market establishes itself as the only vision of the world and everything in it. You know, so that's the world in which I was writing. And then there was in India there was the rise of the social sciences as well,
Yeah.
and the English language, because the English language was so central to globalization. Um, and and the English language with the Indian novel did not seem to admit of idiosyncratic departures from a particular norm which defined itself as the Indian novel, you know, which itself is a very restrictive rather than an inclusive
Yeah.
Category. I didn't write in the absence of the social sciences. I wrote against the grain of the social sciences. And I think that if you look at the inception of the literary and of literature, if you look at Tagore, I think Tagore is also going against, literature is defining itself against the grain of the historian.
Yeah.
Tagore's view of history is defining itself against the archival view of history. History as national archive, as national storehouse. That's not how he's looking at it. He's looking at the historical as a particular kind of consciousness of the past, but not an ownership of the past. He makes it very clear that this consciousness does not equal to ownership. In fact, ownership destroys that consciousness.
The reception of many of your novels, perhaps especially Friend of Your Youth and Afternoon Rag, have focused on how they feel and read like nonfiction or like essays. Nowadays, we might call them autofiction, obviously, which, especially regarding Nosgard, Ben Lerner, Rachel Cusk, seem to a lot of people to be somewhat new as a term for the Anglophone reader. In fact, you remarked in N+1 that Nosgard seemed to be one of your species that perhaps he found deeply interesting what others found fundamentally boring, the everyday and its poetics, quote unquote. That again circles back to the point about banality, but I want to question really about this idea of autofiction and the relationship between fiction and the essay and other nonfiction forms. How do you feel about that, and how do you feel especially about this positing of autofiction as something new?
Person of my species, and I don't. I was just second guessing whether Knausgard is part of it, but I can think of others who are part of that species. Find extremely interesting what others find boring, uh, and have to add there, as maybe I did in the essay, I find very boring what others find interesting. It was good for a friend of my youth to be discussed in terms of its form. I mean, but all my writing has generally been discussed in terms of writing and form, or if not form, in terms of its writing, and not so much its subject matter. You know, so it's not so much that, you know, how does he represent his country, or, you know, that might come in because of the temptations to do that, but generally it's not to do with that. But then, you know, categories are limited, especially for literary journalists. So the things might begin to then fall into the category of good writing or beautiful writing, and all of that. None of which are my primary concerns. Autofiction is an ugly word. I don't like it, and it doesn't do very much for me. And I am interested in the relationship between writing and life. Um, uh, and to me, there is no sort of sequence in which one follows the other. That is, for most people, it's we live and then we write about experiences we've accumulated while living. Formal kind of preoccupations when it comes to writers from outside of the West are not looked upon uh, as a first kind of or primary feature of the writing. Formal preoccupations are supposed to be part of the European avant-garde. Although form and what form can be has been contributed hugely to by Indian and other kinds of writing from other parts of the world, and uh, the West in its straitjacketed kind of understanding or representation through the Renaissance becoming exposed to those inheritances. Those inheritances are not mystical inheritances. They are that, but they are also inheritances that think differently about critical thought and creative language. They think differently from the Renaissance and the Enlightenment about those things. And it's a bit puzzling and bewildering for me to see people um, suddenly waking up to the fact of a particular kind of novel, and then curtailing its history so that it only belongs to a particular place and a particular time, which goes back no more than, let's say, 5 years or whatever. And just as one begins to feel, oh, that's nice, this kind of novel is coming into view, one also feels, oh, but of course, this kind of novel is coming into view within terms set by a particular group of people, deliberately setting those terms in a particular way without bothering to actually look at the history of that kind of fiction or practice, or why that practice was undertaken.
Right.
And here I would not only blame the people who live in Brooklyn or wherever that metaphorical or figurative place might be, but I would also talk about Indians, again, just to take a convenient sort of, but also because I'm Indian, uh, that we have done hardly anything uh, to speak about our histories, our practices, and even to speak about contemporary practice and why we are writing in a particular way. You know, um, it's the Indian input into this is extremely disappointing. And if they take autofiction on now, they take it on completely on the terms set
Right.
for them already by Brooklyn, etc., etc. That's very sad.
Yeah.
You know, Bashir was writing autofiction. Long before Bashir, others were writing autofiction in Indian languages.
That's
Uh, they did not think of them as autofiction, but they belong to that tradition where they're experimenting in exploring the relationship with writing, between writing and life, and not seeing writing as just a reportage about life or
mm-hmm.
a representation of one's life.
Mm-hmm.
Bringing one's life in, but not as representation, but as an extension, something that extended and changed what we understood to be writing. This is the tradition that I'm talking about. You know, and Manto was doing that. Colette was doing that.
My instinctive response to a lot of what you've said, and also when I conjoin that with the reception of your work, with the very common refrain that nothing really happens very much, and but also your observation that critics have pontificated on the form of your novels quite a bit. And you've said again in that N+1 essay that it's not that I'm resistant to appropriation. I'm unfit for appropriation. So this isn't really a question so much as me wanting to put it on the record that I actually think that's a luxurious and wonderful place to be, and that is precisely what I aspire to as a writer too. That I crave the idea where my work is regarded as nothing really happens, and critics pontificate on form, because I think that's a to me, I think that's a self-reflexive compliment of the highest order, to be very honest. I think that is that sort of interplay where there is a deep recognition that we can talk about things in form that are universals, right? As opposed to Indian writers are writing about India.
My responses, the way I write, does have a lot to do from where I am and from my own history,
Of course.
but not in the pre-decided way that we've been told these things, add up to a mean.
Yeah.
And the being unfit for appropriation has been for me a difficult place to be, rather than a luxurious or easy one. It's almost 30 years have passed now,
Right for it.
since when I have began to not only write but understand what I was doing and what it was that made me um, unfit for appropriation. You know, um, I would have loved to have been appropriated, um, and I would love to be on a bandwagon and be with others and be happy about it. But I was not fit for that, and it has taken me a long time to figure out why and what it was that I was working towards, and whether there was something wrong with me, or whether I was up to something uh, in creating some set of terms. So that were different from the terms available. So it's taken me a while, and it's still ongoing. This kind of desire to understand, uh, this kind of this being unfit to be appropriated, and of course I realize it's a great thing. It's a good thing that's what I was kind of. That's what I was,
When you discuss this idea that you felt to a certain degree that you needed to engage with Proust, for instance, that is a level of discourse that is difficult, I think, for and plenty of Indian writers to achieve. And I think that partly the reason why is because there may not be as much of a preoccupation with um, there may not be as much of an engagement with the idea or resistance to the idea that India produces Indian writing, you know. And I think that resistance perhaps is what is definitional almost to this concept of this aspirational concept of being able to pontificate on your form as opposed to your subject, if that makes sense. I do want to talk about um, modality, right? And you've talked about poetry, but and you're known, I think, at least for me, you're known primarily to me as a writer, but you've worn and obviously continue to wear so many hats, right? You're a novelist, you're an essayist, poet, musician, artist, critic, professor, one might say public intellectual, I think seriously. And how do you feel your work across such a wide variety of modes has influenced your artistic practice as a whole? And I think in particular, how has it influenced your novelistic practice, actually?
I've had the freedom to pursue these these different impulses. I never planned to sort of become a novelist. My plan was to be a poet because I loved poetry. I never planned to do a kind of to embark on a project called, which was initially called "This Is Not Fusion." I was never interested in fusion. When I was 15 years old, I wouldn't have known, but that the next year, when I was 16, I'd be giving all my time to Indian classical music. Because that year I was playing the guitar and would just begin to write songs. And I've been possessed by different impulses. When I'm possessed by an impulse, then I want, if I first kind of think about whether that impulse makes sense or has any justification, because one is suspicious of that impulse. And this is true to do with impulses to undertake new genres or forms of activity. But it's also true of individual works undertaken. Similarly with music, said, summertime, bring in Rag Malkons. It comes to you one day, that idea, because you're singing it in a particular way. It's not as if you think, what can I do to change summertime? The convergence comes to you at a certain moment. I'm saying the impulse behind individual works is met with the same kind of hesitation as the idea that I want to do Hindustani classical music, or I want to create some artworks, because I've been getting these ideas for artworks. To create those artworks, it took me 7 years, because I just thought that, is this a serious idea? So what I'm saying is that these are different different extensions of the limit of one's known self. I'm very self-reflexive in the sense that I'm aware at every point of the contingency of what I'm doing. What I'm doing is not a given. That is why I have to be self-reflexive. If what I was doing, everything was a given, and the role became me,
Right.
then I would not need to be self-reflexive. I am self-reflexive because I do not fit into these roles naturally.
Right. Yeah.
And yet I am making use of genres, making use of particular conventions and languages. That is what I need to understand, what it is I'm doing over there. In that sense, I'm all about self-reflexivity. But I'm not about having any sort of predetermined idea of what it means to be a writer, or to be an Indian writer, or this writer or that writer, or writer of autofiction, or writer of realism, or whatever. That is what makes me self-reflexive, I think.
So I want to ask about the art, about the piece of art that hangs right behind you, the one that I can see. Um, what, what, who made that? I'm curious about that.
Which one?
Yes.
That's Jamini Roy.
Yes. So, I mean, the reason I recognized this is because I think Jamini Roy also graces the cover of The Triumph of Modernism, Partha Mitter's book, The Triumph of Modernism, India's Art in the Avant-Garde, 1922 to 1947. And I was speaking to him just recently about, about the category of the avant-garde, and how the perception that the avant-garde is a specifically European phenomenon, and that India didn't have avant-gardes in particular. And obviously he rejects that notion, and he pushes back against it by saying, no, by the interaction between the West and the non-West, created new avant-garde such as primitivism, and Jamini Roy was certainly working in that tradition, primitivism, and Tagore as well, with Cubism, and many other traditions that were organic to that particular time period that he was working in, 1922 to 1947. Um, but I had one question for him that I still feel like. So, firstly, how do you feel about this? And secondly, the one question that I still have not been able to resolve after reading his book and others on the avant-garde is why it is that avant-garde seems to crop up so much more when we're talking about Bengali art in particular, as opposed to other areas of South Asia. I have absolutely no idea why that's the case. Do you?
About these Jamini Roys, I think my father bought them when he was alive, very cheap. They were about 150 rupees or something
Yeah.
each, and
Wow, that's a cool.
yeah, and he was there, because there was a kind of rumor about him those days that he didn't produce all the Jamini Roys; he just signed them.
Mhm.
Um, and I've described that experience in a semi-fictional form of the trajectory of Indian art and of these lives that came into contact with that art in a story called The Old Masters. I just thought I'd say that. Um, it's available in the LRB archives for free, maybe. So, in case anybody wants to have a look at that account of how art impinged upon lives. Um, and I should also add that a Jamini Roy is there on the jacket of the Picador Book of Modern Indian Writing.
Yeah.
Uh, so, so you mentioning Parthometer's book and its jacket kind of reminded me
Yeah.
of that. I like Parthometer's assignation of these originary dates to Indian modernism or Bengali modernism in art. I think he sort of uh, establishes Tagore and Stella Cramrich's initiative to bring in Bauhaus painters and exhibit them in 1922 alongside some Bengali painters as, for him, the starting point for modernism in Bengal. And of course, I mentioned this to him, and I was touched that he did not know of the literary resonances of that particular date, which is also when Ulysses and The Wasteland were published, 1922.
Hmm.
But I'm, I like this kind of the the attempt to reimagine that he's undertaking
Yeah.
in arriving at such a date, because Indian art historians shy away from such
Yeah.
acts of reimagination and dating, partly because they feel they have no ownership of modernism.
Right.
While anybody from Parthometer's generation would know that uh, all these things are common inheritances,
Mm-hmm.
you know, um, and a great deal happened in various parts of the world, which is very, very interesting in terms of creativity and response. So maybe he's being true to that in seeking out that moment. For me, the moment goes back earlier. If I were to set a date of that kind, again, it would be vis-a-vis Tagore,
Yeah.
and it would be his, and I've written about this before, it would be his essay on children's nursery rhymes, Bengali nursery rhymes, where he, for the first time anywhere, mentions or defines stream of consciousness in a literary context.
Right.
So this is in 1894, I think. And stream of consciousness, the term has just been coined by William James a couple of years before that.
Mm-hmm.
in psychology.
Yeah.
So Tagore is either coming to it on his own, or he's coming to it via William James, but he's then transposing it. He sees it's a literary idea. James must have himself got it from, you know, texts that speak about the consciousness rather than gods and religion, like the Upanishads. These speak about the consciousness, the nature of consciousness. So Tagore then, to whom also the Upanishads was interesting and important and significant, he transposes this idea to the realm of the literary and sees it is a kind of important, an extremely important idea that has to do with literature. And his argument is this. He says that my contemporaries are collecting oral culture or oral literature, nursery rhymes, Bengali rhymes, because this is why they're doing it. They're experts in their field, and they are creating a storehouse of oral culture to show maybe that um, India and Bengal has as rich a tradition in these things as the West has, as England has. But he says, however, this work is very important. However, I too have been collecting these rhymes, but my interest in them is different from theirs. And here you come to the first kind of, or one of the early formulations of literature going against the grain of the social sciences, of the archive, of the historical research-based sort of understanding of documents and culture, going against that. So he says, I am interested in these rhymes because they retain a kind of associativeness which is not permitted by the adult mind. The adult mind is adheres to a linear form of thinking. He calls it on and on and on. And he calls the mind an authority. These are the Bengali words he uses for the mind. An authority or authoritative and masterful. And he says, but the rhymes do not move in that fashion, and they make room for what he calls the anavashyak, or which means the unnecessary, or the superfluous, or the irrelevant. And he says, I like these rhymes because they make room for what the adult mind filters out, and that is the superfluous.
Right.
And he says, if you look at the daily flow of our consciousness, it is full of all kinds of things, and not only the significant things. It's full of all, if you look at the flow, it is full of all a jumble of things. And much of it is unnecessary or superfluous. For me, this is the starting point of modernism, not just in India, but maybe anywhere. Mm-hmm. Nobody is
wow,
is making that kind of observation at that time. Why we speak about avant-gardes in relationship to Bengal, I don't know. For me, that is not true. I think avant-gardes are to be found everywhere in the world. And if we take the term world cinema, we realize that it has almost become synonymous with avant-garde or modernist cinema. While Hollywood means a very conservative understanding of representation, of cinematic representation, of narrative representation. If you want to go outside of Hollywood and a very conventional Enlightenment, Renaissance-led understanding of what representation is, then you go to the world. You go to world cinema.
Yeah.
So while I reject the vanguardism of the avant-garde, that it can get kind of appropriated by this story of development.
Right.
So the avant-gardes exist only in the West.
Yeah.
because they produce everything or the latest of everything, whether it's a motor car or the intelligentsia or a group of creative. No, that's not what the avant-garde is.
Yeah.
And avant-garde is a particular kind of critique, and it exists everywhere. It's a very liberating kind of critique, and it exists everywhere, in India, in outside of the West, in various parts of the world. And these are people who who pursue anomalous forms of representation rather than the conventional ones. And that's why I felt so close to writers who write in the Indian languages, because of these proclivities.
I love this, the making the connection to world cinema, because it really it snaps into focus when you say that. But also I really enjoy this, and I want to think about this more, this idea of the avant-garde is perhaps anti-teleological, because I think that teleology has been identified, I mean, in various forms, teleology is resisted, but in particular, as we think about the avant-garde, it can be useful in terms of how teleology is disrupted at the moment of of the avant-garde creation, so to speak. But since you've been talking about other Indian writers, and since you know the South Asian, the project that we're undertaking, South Asian Avant-Garde, is an anthology. I want to move on to the business of anthologizing. I'd like to talk about that, and you know so much about it. In in a wonderful article by Sumana Roy, who we're working with, and who's wonderful. So in an essay about your work, she invoked words you discussed in your talk at Kolkata's President's University in 2017, and there's a marvelous sentence by her describing your approach, which is, either writing or speaking, involves interventions through anthologies that have made us think of how the business of anthologizing traditions might be approached radically. So I know contextually that she was not referring solely to literary anthologies, but let's pretend for a second that she was. And I want to ask you if you can expand on that for literary anthologies. How can anthologies be approached radically?
I grew up in an age of anthologies, in the sense that poetry anthologies is how we readers like myself were introduced to a lot of poets from America and the UK and Ireland. You know, but when it came to Indian writing, it was one was faced with a challenge, and it was a challenge similar to trying to anthologize something called world literature, and something which has no existence in itself. And in Indian literature is the same. There's no such thing, you know. So one can go about it by adding things, by adding literatures up. Marathi and Bengali and Tamil, and writing in English, and come up with something called Indian literature. Just as you can come up with something called world literature as a mathematical formulation, adding up, you
Yeah.
know, Danish and English and French or whatever. But that's not literature. And so anthologizing in that sense, beginning by working on Indian literature, was a challenge in terms of thinking what an anthology might be and what literature is. And I had a very interesting radical precursor in Arvind Krishna Mehrotra's 12 Modern Indian Poets, the Oxford Anthology, where it seemed to be that he was making a case for the existence of something called Indian poetry in English after independence, not because it was a given, but through a series of interrelationships, and exploring interrelationships in his head between these works and these poets.
I just have one final question, really. I mean, I could keep you here for 24 hours. Well, I could keep you here for all week, to be very honest. I want to ask about something, but I think there's an important question that we haven't dealt with yet, which is, I want to discuss the Picador Book of Modern Indian Literature of 2001. For those in the know, they'll know there's some very fiery context to all this in the wake of Salman Rushdie's claim that Indian writing in English is stronger and more important than bodies of writing in other languages. You saw things differently. But when The Guardian reviewed your anthology, it wrote in his note on selection at the beginning of his absorbing new anthology, Amit Chaudhuri states that it is not a riposte to any other anthology, but it's hard not to think that it is. Especially for those who may not know about this context, the late 90s, very early aughts, what was this all about? And how do you feel about that sentiment expressed in The Guardian? And I want to take this a step further to perhaps suggest to you that, especially for the South Asian writers that I am engaged with and I have been talking to for, many years now, for as long as I've been a writer, there is a sense that that strand of thinking or whatever it was that was disagreed upon has not been picked up since. So I'd love your thoughts on that.
It wasn't a riposte to Salman Rushdie. You mentioned that the Guardian said that it was difficult to think that it wasn't a riposte, right? But no, it was not a riposte. It was a riposte to a particular environment. That environment had to do with this idea that Indian writing in English or the Indian novel in English was Indian writing, and that it had somehow come into existence the other day, and thereby completely impoverish the our histories, a history that I grew up with at home, for instance, and impoverish our understanding of who we were, what our art forms were. Many of our classical art forms have been revived by moderns, other creation of moderns. What it meant to be a modern, and who our parents were. There were people who read certain books. There were people who were extremely experimental in their lives and in their thinking, sometimes far more than we are. Who were these people, and how were we a product of that culture? And were we going to now lose our sense of it simply because we didn't have the apparatus to think about it? So we would not look for that apparatus because it was not being given to us by publishers, by journalists who never wrote or never a word of criticism or never thought critically at any point. So were we going to be just happy with that state of affairs and accept it? Again, I mean, it would be nice to have that level of acceptance and happiness and content. But I unfortunately, I wasn't that kind of person. I would have been a much happier person if I were, So the riposte was to that, to a lack of a sense of history, to a lack of nuance when it came to history. Not only our history, but the history of modernity and of literature, and our role in it, our relationship to it.
Thank you so much for talking with me and for us.